Hi, this is Joel Rosenberg in Jerusalem for All Israel News and our sister site, All Arab News. Fascinating things going on as 2021 begins. We've got a visit coming up within the next few days by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to Abu Dhabi, the political capital of the United Arab Emirates. He's expected to be on the ground for 3 hours to meet with the de facto leader of the United Arab Emirates, the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi, Mohammed bin Zayed. The trip had been intended to be a 3-day, really splashy state visit, but because of COVID and a lot of these type of restrictions, they're down to 3 hours. Still, I think it's going to be history, and we're going to talk about that and how we got to the Abraham Accords with our special guest today, Jason Greenblatt. Jason was the special envoy for President Trump to the Middle East, involved in international negotiations, and he was really one of the point people with Jared Kushner in trying to figure out how is it possible and how would you get to the point of bringing about Arab-Israeli peace agreements. Jason, thank you so much for spending time with us on All Israel News.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be here, Joel. As you know, I'm a big fan of your books. Of course, when I started reading your books years ago, I never would have imagined I'd end up in the role that I did. So it's kind of interesting to be here with you and to be discussing these topics.
I don't know if it's out of school, but actually when you and I first met, we were at the King David Hotel in Jerusalem on the back porch having dinner. I was having dinner with the then incoming ambassador for international religious freedom, Sam Brownback, and his wife and some of his colleagues. You and your family were at a table a few tables away, and I told Sam, hey, you probably should go say hi to Jason, and I don't think you guys had met yet. But the next thing I knew, you were coming over to the table and introducing yourself, and that was such a nice way to meet. I didn't know you yet and didn't know you had been reading my novels.
Yeah, no, it was great. And that happens to be one of my favorite spots in all of Jerusalem.
I can't wait for it to be reopened. Yeah. Okay. Let's start with, why don't you give us a preview of what you would expect to happen, what you're looking for out of the Netanyahu MBZ meeting. It's pretty dramatic, even if it's reduced to 3 hours. We haven't seen an Israeli prime minister in one of these Gulf states since the signing of the Abraham Accords. So what are you looking for?
Well, what I expect is going to be a very warm, personal meeting between the two leaders. They both worked hard to get this deal done under the leadership of President Trump and their leadership. I think we need to especially commend His Royal Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed. What he did was very bold, very courageous, a real trailblazer in this. And I think that the world recognizes now that Israel has so much more in common with its neighbors, that everybody was held back because of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That doesn't mean that conflict, we shouldn't work hard to try to resolve that conflict, but holding back everybody else because of that conflict is not good for the region at all. Certainly not good for the United States of America. The UAE and Israel are extremely strong allies of the United States, as are other countries in the region, Bahrain, of course, Morocco, and others who have been part of the Abraham Accords. And I think we're going to see, some real friendship and decision, not formal decisions necessarily, but commitments to continue on this incredible path that they started to blaze some months ago.
What are some of the headlines you think are going to come out of this?
I imagine they're going to make pronouncements regarding business ties, hospitality, tourism. When you speak about hospitality and tourism, the UAE is a great tourist destination. Abu Dhabi is, of course, Dubai. Everybody recognizes the fame of Dubai for tourism. I was there in November. I went to speak at an event. I took 2 of my children there, and it turns out one of my daughters who came with me ended up getting engaged in Dubai, of all things.
I remember seeing that on Twitter, yeah.
Yeah, so it's really quite
Mazel tov.
Thank you so much. But subsequent to that, a few weeks later, the press has reported that somewhere between 50 and 70,000 Israelis came into Dubai, which is a remarkable number, but a remarkable thing to happen. And, COVID is holding things back once again, and I think we're in for a somewhat rocky period in the coming months, despite the fact that Israel is doing a phenomenal job with respect to vaccines, but these new variants are worrying to some. But I think that what we're going to see is closer connections and ties between people, both business people trying to generate deals, make business with each other, and friendships, the kind of friendships that I've managed to forge, not just in the UAE, but throughout the Arab world, including Saudi Arabia, who is not yet a partner in the Abraham Accords, but I have high hopes that eventually it'll happen. And I think that they are going to realize just how much they have, just how much they are alike, and how much they share the same vision for a proactive future of prosperity, stability, and peace.
You left the White House a few months, as it turns out, before the Abraham Accords were all sort of finalized. But you did that in part to enter the world of venture capital. So, since you're talking about the business deals and the trade, technology, the tourism, just take a moment to talk about what do you see coming? I've described it to some, based on a lot of interviews, as a coming Middle East gold rush of sorts. There's a lot of excitement, but you're right in the thick of it.
So what I'm trying to do now is create what I call a Middle East 2.0. I think that peace and stability and connections are heavily tied to building business ties. I've spent the better part of the last year, even through COVID, creating those ties. I represent a variety of companies, some in the hospitality and tourism sector, some in the security space, others in the product space. And what I found at the beginning was, way before the Abraham Accords was announced, was that there was strong interest, but slight trepidation. Less so in the security space. They've been dealing with each other for a long time in the security space. But people were interested in hearing more and interested in figuring out how they could do business together. However, as soon as the Abraham Accords were announced, it really did become a gold rush. And I could tell you, even as of last week, I spent most of the week in Saudi Arabia at the FII conference. The sovereign wealth funds host that conference. And I would say that my time, not just at the conference itself, but visiting with friends in restaurants, at their homes, and just talking to them about the Abraham Accords, about Israel, about the region, the excitement is deeply palpable. And I would not have said that several months ago. When I used to be on Zoom calls, let's say just before the Abraham Accords, people were a little bit concerned about talking about Israel and not necessarily speaking about doing business with Israel.
In Saudi specifically, or the Gulf generally?
In Saudi.
Okay.
Today, even in Saudi, people are excited about the possibilities. Look, in particular, they're excited about His Royal Highness the Crown Prince MBS's vision, not just Vision 2030, but he just unveiled some great plans on the coast of the Red Sea and his plans for Riyadh. People are excited about the region. I think that filters through everywhere. The United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Qatar, certainly Morocco. I think we are about to see sort of a dawn of a new economic powerhouse among this group of countries, and where possible in partnership with Israel, and we're not possible, at least not in the spotlight, in partnership with Israel, or directly or indirectly in many ways.
And I think that we'd be remiss not to mention in this moment in this discussion the very dramatic, if theoretically secret, meeting between Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, the Mossad chief Yossi Cohen, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, and Secretary Pompeo in that northwest quadrant that MBS sent me and our evangelical delegation 2 years ago to go visit, in that northwest quadrant of Saudi Arabia, that they expect to be a $500 billion new, not just series of cities, but a whole province that would be regionally based and one of the most dramatic, high-tech tourist centers. That is, wouldn't you say that that's a signal of what's coming?
I want to be careful and not get into words like signal because it would be politically not great to try to read those tea leaves. But I do agree that having heard about the project so many times from His Royal Highness the Crown Prince and many of his advisors, and the proximity to where it is next to 4 different countries, I think it is a sign of what we hope will be a continued path from the Abraham Accords. I think there can be so much in that region. There's so much undeveloped land in Saudi Arabia. This is a particularly pristine and beautiful area of land. He's ready to pump a fortune in there. And I think we should all watch it, because how often do you get to see something like that created out of nothing? And with the power of Saudi Arabia, I think that to create something just quite incredible.
Well, he put MBS put us on his plane, sent us up to the north, just driving with our group along these pristine beaches. Not a single hotel, not a single home yet, nothing. The opportunity, and yet you're talking about Egypt, 100 million people just across the way. You've got Jordan, obviously a wonderful, educated population, but looking for more trade and growth, and obviously Israel and Saudi Arabia. I'm excited about it, and I know that they were also talking about Iran, which is a huge concern and somewhat of a driving force into bringing the Gulf and Israel together. But let's take a moment. Let's go back, and you coming into the Trump administration, the original plan, if I understand it, the theory was, let's create the most detailed and creative plan to try to bring Israelis and Palestinians to a full negotiated agreement, a final agreement that's ever been released in, ever. Almost everybody, I would say everybody in the peace industry in the Middle East and Washington and Brussels said it couldn't be done. The plan would be dead on arrival. And I remember when you and I first got to know each other, the question was like, why? Why spend this much effort and this much political capital? What did President Trump want to do? Why did you agree to help him? And at what point did the pivot come that a deal with the Palestinians was not possible, but with the Gulf states, it might be possible?
Okay, a lot of layers to that question. All very important aspects.
Well, you're the right guy to ask.
I'll try to capture that. I wouldn't say that we started in that direction. Our goal initially was to meet with all the relevant parties, not just the Israelis and the Palestinians, but certainly the region, many of the people who had been involved in past efforts, and really try to understand what the playing field looked like at the time that we entered. And you're right that many people were critical and said that any plan we would put forth would be dead on arrival. Imagine what they said after President Trump's bold and courageous and historic decision of recognizing Jerusalem in December of 2017, and the Palestinians cutting us off and all that. There were lots of moving parts here and lots of ups and downs. But one of the things we kept coming back to, in my opinion, is that when you look at things like the Arab Peace Initiative, which is just quite a breathtaking document when you think about it from years ago, the
2002, ratified by the Arab League.
It didn't really say a lot. It was aspirational, it was hopeful, but if you boil it down, it said if Israel were to make peace with the Palestinians under the terms more or less that the Palestinians demanded, not we're entitled to, and that's important, but demanded, then maybe the next day or in a year or never, maybe the Arab neighbors will make peace with Israel. That's not a great contract. And I'm a lawyer. I've been in the legal business for many years. So we felt that we could no longer sort of hope that these aspirational documents, which are well-meaning, could actually achieve a peace accord. So we approached it then from two points. One is to create a very, very detailed peace plan that we hoped would allow everybody involved to understand what the compromises are, what the benefits are. So it's not just, like a line or two that sounds lovely, a diplomatically crafted word that you could leave the room thinking, well, that sounds great and feeling good, but actually with teeth in it, with details in it, so people could think to themselves, is it worth it? Separately, it also made no sense to me that Israel would forge a peace agreement with the Palestinians and not know that they would indeed end up having peace with its Arab neighbors. What kind of peace agreement would that be? So over time, we recognized that while the two conflicts, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the Israeli-Arab conflict, were intricately entwined together, they could actually be separated and solved separately if the parties were willing. By the time I left the White House, there was no strong indication that that would happen anytime soon, meaning everybody was still very much, I would say, much more open-minded, much more willing to discuss, much more understanding of the issues, willing to think outside the box, et cetera. But they weren't quite ready at the time to jump into the Abraham Accords. But over the ensuing months, after a variety of things have happened, they did. And I think we see the initial thought of separating the conflicts and trying to solve them together, separately, could work despite everybody's criticism.
You're right. It was a big concept. Yeah.
I just want to stress one last thing.
Sure.
It was never meant to leave the Palestinians behind. The Palestinians left themselves behind, and I think that was a huge mistake. So people who claim that this was meant to continue to destroy the Palestinian peoples and wishes and hopes, that's a very false description of what happened.
Well, I appreciate that. And we've been interviewing a range of Palestinian and other Arab leaders, and we will continue to do that, try to figure out what's the next steps. I think one of the things that's interesting to me is that, the president and the team put out a 180-page plan, the most detailed peace plan ever. And it wasn't a plan to bring the Gulf states together with Israel. It was the details of that plan is specifically to figure out how do you thread the needle and create some sort of conclusion to the Israeli-Palestinian plan. But is it fair to say that without that plan, even though it was dismissed and sort of formally so by the Arab League, not hostilely criticized, I don't think, but no, that plan we don't agree with the way it's written. But that plan did suggest to many in the region, based on my reporting, that the president was serious, that he was sincere. President Trump was sincere in wanting to get to a conclusion, some sort of agreement that was reasonable between the Israelis and the Palestinians, which the rejection of that plan in its entirety, without even discussing it, by the Palestinian leadership seems to have, I don't know, maybe I'll use the word legitimized the Gulf states thinking, well, look, we want these two sides to talk, but if they won't, we're not going to wait forever. Is that a fair read, or is that an unfair, inaccurate way to read things?
No, I think it's a fair read. I think that despite the criticism from the Palestinians and some criticism from the Arab countries, though many actually not only mildly criticized, but some actually understood why we put out what we put out. As you know, there were several countries that showed up to the ceremony at the White House when President Trump unveiled the plan a little over a year ago, and they should all be commended, Oman, Bahrain, and the UAE, which then felt like a big deal.
Yeah, but that was huge. Dayenu, we would say, right? This alone would be enough.
Right. I remember taking photographs there with the ambassadors of those countries and my family, thinking, wow, that's amazing. And now my family is just constantly traveling to these countries. It's really quite a change in well under a year. But I think that's right. I don't think we could have jumped from nothing to the Abraham Accords. I think that spending time learning about the plan, putting out a plan that we deemed realistic and implementable, despite the criticisms from many, was an essential step. I think the entire process from when President Trump stepped into the Oval Office until and including anything that happened under, pre the announcement of the Abraham Accords and the various signings were essential building blocks to get to where they got to. I think that earning a level of trust, trying in good faith to reach a peace deal with the Palestinians' rejection, perhaps the biggest, one of the biggest things that happened with the Abraham Accords was it removed the veto card from the Palestinian leadership. They could no longer hold up the region. I noticed this morning there was an article, I haven't verified the accuracy yet, but there was an article that suggested that President al-Sisi is conditioning Prime Minister Netanyahu's visit to Egypt with Prime Minister Netanyahu supporting a two-state solution. Let's assume for purposes of this discussion that that is accurate. I think that's a mistake. I think Prime Minister Netanyahu is not going to say it. And we also try to remind people that the phrase two-state solution means so many different things to different people. What's the purpose of using that three-word ambiguous statement, it gets nothing. It doesn't get Palestinians better lives. It doesn't explain to Israel what's required in terms of a compromise. And that's why we developed that 180-page plan that you refer to. So I'm against anything that goes back to the old-fashioned ways of doing things, reflexively going back to language. I'm not criticizing what people did then. I'm not criticizing the ideas. I'm not even criticizing the phrase as used 10 and 10 years ago, let's say. But what I am saying is that we learned very clearly and very early on that ambiguous phrases, ambiguous UN resolutions, references to international law, which in my opinion, and I had support from this from the administration, actually don't apply to this conflict. They're also not binding or clear enough. None of that is going to bring about peace. The only way to bring about peace is for parties to roll up their sleeves, do the hard work. I hope the Palestinian leadership does do that. I hope they clean their house up, between Hamas and the PA. And only then can they start negotiating with Israel directly. But that should not come at the expense of all of Israel's neighbors who can benefit tremendously by joining together and doing business together and being friendly together and keeping security together.
I agree with you, and I appreciate your time. Last question, super fast, lightning. What's your recommendation to President Biden to build upon the Abraham Accords?
Well, I hope at the first instance, I hope he doesn't go backwards. And I have no reason to think that. But I think if he moves too far forward with Iran in a way that the region gets nervous, that is going to send things in an unfortunate direction. I think with respect to Iran, the most important voices at the table have to be the region. It has to be Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Israel, Bahrain, everybody there, Qatar. I think that he should try to get other countries to join. No pressure. You can't apply pressure to any of these countries. They have to want to join. But I think he should signal that he is very encouraging of doing it. And I think we saw some positive statements coming out of the Biden administration and even President Biden during his candidacy, which is good. But if they do go back to the tying the Palestinian conflict back together again with the Arab-Israeli conflict, not only is it not going to be effective, I think it's going to hinder some progress with the Abraham Accords. So my suggestion would be to continue to treat them separately, try to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, try to get the Palestinian leadership to understand that the U.S. can help improve lives, and you shouldn't tie improvement of lives with the politics either, which was one of the battles I had frequently, and allow this region to grow together and thrive and prosper.
Sounds good. And I am hopeful that we'll see Oman and, of course, and other states, and ultimately the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. My instinct is that they are heading there, but that the conversation that's going on in the region is helpful because 70% of the country of Saudi Arabia is under the age of 30. They care, but they're not passionate about the Arab-Israeli conflict per se. But the 30% or so that's of the older generation, they remember 48, 56, 67, 73, and they have some strong feelings. And so the general climate of positive developments going on, I think is being helpful. I think it will be helpful. I think we're seeing it in polls. I think we're seeing it from the MBS meeting. But we'll see. There's a lot more ahead. I hope 2021 is a lot more encouraging on the COVID front, on the economic front, as well as continuing on the Arab-Israeli front from 2020. Jason Greenblatt, thank you so much for taking time out of your very busy schedule to give us your insights. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you. Thank you for hosting me, and I look forward to talking again.
I look forward to seeing you face to face. I'm Joel Rosenberg in Jerusalem for all Israel news and all Arab news. Thank you for joining us.